Han Dojin had never been good with people. He was good with words, written ones, old ones, dead ones that nobody spoke anymore. He could read ancient texts that made other linguists cry with frustration. He could break apart alien grammar structures the way a mechanic takes apart an engine. But put him in a room with actual living people and ask him to make conversation, and he became the most useless man in any solar system. That was exactly why he had no idea how he ended up standing in the polished welcome hall of Solace Ring, the first joint human Lunari diplomatic station, wearing a freshly pressed uniform that still smelled like plastic packaging, waiting to meet aliens. The station orbited a neutral moon halfway between Earth's territory and the Lunari homeworld. It was enormous, a spinning ring of metal and glass with long observation corridors that looked out into the cold beauty of space. Humans lived on one side, the Lunari lived on the other, and in the middle was the shared zone, where the two species were supposed to learn about each other through something the politicians called the Cultural Exchange Program. Dojin called it a headache. He was there because he was a linguist, one of the few who had spent the last 2 years studying the Lunari language from the limited recordings Earth had received. He had volunteered because the language fascinated him. It was musical, layered, full of meaning that shifted depending on tone and context. A single Lunari word could mean 10 different things depending on how it was said. It was the most beautiful language he had ever studied. The problem was that studying a language in a quiet room on Earth and actually using it in front of real Lunari were two very different things. Beck Suri, his best friend and the station's communications engineer, stood next to him with her arms crossed and a grin on her face. She had known Dojin since university. She had watched him trip over his own words in 3 human languages. She could not wait to see him do it in an alien one. "Stop sweating," she whispered. "I'm not sweating." "Your forehead says otherwise." Before he could respond, the far doors opened and the Lunari delegation walked in. Dojin had seen pictures. He had watched videos, but nothing prepared him for seeing them in person. The Lunari were tall, taller than most humans by at least a head. Their skin was a pale, shimmering silver, smooth like polished stone but alive with a faint inner glow. Their eyes were large and vivid, colored in deep shades of violet and blue, and their hair, long, flowing, translucent, shifted color like light passing through crystal. It moved on its own, reacting to their emotions, their thoughts, the air around them. They were stunning, every single one of them. The briefing documents had been very clear about etiquette. Bow slightly when greeting. Do not touch their hair. It was a sensory organ, not decoration. Speak calmly and clearly. The Lunari were sensitive to vocal tone and could pick up emotional frequencies that humans could not even hear. Loud or aggressive speech was considered an act of hostility. Dojin had memorized all of this. He had made flashcards. The Lunari delegation consisted of 5 members, led by a tall male with sharp features and cold silver eyes. That was Kyle, the military attaché. Dojin had read his file. Former soldier, protective of his people, did not trust humans, and standing just behind Kyle was her. She was slightly shorter than the others, though still taller than Dojin. Her skin had a warmer tone than the rest, less cold silver, more soft moonlight. Her eyes were a deep, glowing violet, framed by long lashes that looked like they were made of frost. Her hair fell past her shoulders in waves of pale light, shifting between white and the faintest shade of lavender. She wore the traditional Lunari diplomatic veil, a thin, translucent cloth that covered the lower half of her face. Behind it, Dojin could see the outline of her features, but nothing clear. The veil, he knew, was a formality. It would be removed once trusted work began. It was a sign of distance, worn until the Lunari felt safe enough to show their full face. Her name was Yanara. She was the cultural liaison, the person Dojin would be working with directly for the entire program. The welcome ceremony was short and formal. Both sides bowed. Speeches were given. Dojin stood in the back and tried not to look nervous, which of course made him look more nervous. Suri elbowed him twice. Afterward, the teams split into their assigned pairs. Dojan and Yanara were given a small workroom on the shared side of the station, a clean, quiet space with a long table, soft lighting, and a window that looked out at the stars. Yanara entered first. Dojin followed, clutching his translation notes like a shield. "I am Yanara," she said. Her voice was calm and smooth, like water moving over glass. "I will be teaching you about our customs and assisting with linguistic mapping. I hope we can work well together." "Han Dojin," he said, bowing slightly. "Linguist. One? Yes. Working well. Together. I hope that too." Suri would have buried her face in her hands. Yenara studied him for a moment, her violet eyes unreadable. Then she reached up and unclasped her diplomatic veil. The cloth fell away. Dojin had thought she was striking before, even with her face half hidden. But without the veil, she was something else entirely. Her face was delicate and sharp at the same time. High cheekbones, a soft mouth, a jawline that could have been carved by an artist who believed in perfection. Her skin glowed faintly in the station's light, and her hair, reacting to the act of unveiling, which was a sign of trust, shifted to a calm, pale blue. She looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to begin the session, but Dojin's brain had stopped working. His mouth, unfortunately, had not. He was not even aware he was speaking. It was a whisper, barely a breath, muttered in Korean the way he muttered everything, half to himself, half to the universe that never listened. "She's really beautiful." The translator chip embedded behind his ear, the one designed to pick up and convert every spoken word into the listener's language in real time, did exactly what it was built to do. It translated his words, perfectly, instantly, into flawless Lunari. The room went silent. Not the normal kind of silent. The kind of silent that happens when the air itself holds its breath. Yenra's eyes widened. Her lips parted. Her hair, the beautiful, translucent, emotion-reading hair, flushed from calm blue to a deep, burning rose gold. The color spread from the roots to the tips like fire catching on silk. She stared at him. Her hands, which had been resting at her sides, curled into fists. Not from anger, from something else. Something Dojin did not recognize because he had no idea what he had just done. She took one step toward him. Her voice when she spoke was barely above a whisper. It trembled at the edges, soft and shaking, like a note played on a string pulled too tight. "Say it again, human." Dojin blinked. His brain finally caught up with his mouth. The blood drained from his face. He looked at her flushed hair, her wide eyes, her trembling hands, and realized that he had said something terrible, or wonderful, or both. And he did not know which, and that was the worst part. So he did what any rational, trained, professional linguist would do in that situation. He grabbed his notes, mumbled something that was not a word in any language, and walked out of the room as fast as his legs could carry him. Behind him, Yanara stood alone in the quiet workroom, her hair still blazing rose gold, her hand half raised as if reaching for someone who was already gone. She lowered her hand slowly. She pressed it against her chest, and for a long time she did not move at all. Dojin did not stop walking until he reached the human side of the station. He passed through 2 security doors, one corridor lined with supply crates, and a rec room full of off-duty engineers, before he found Suri sitting in the cafeteria with a cup of coffee and a tablet. She looked up. She saw his face. She put down the coffee. "What did you do?" "Nothing." "Your face says you committed a war crime." Dojin sat down across from her and put his head on the table. The metal was cold against his forehead. It did not help. "I said something," he muttered into the table. "You say things all the time. Most of them are boring. What did you say?" He lifted his head just enough to look at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen his own death and was not sure it had finished happening yet. "I called her beautiful." Suri stared at him. Then she picked up her coffee again and took a long, slow sip. She set it down. She folded her hands. You called the Lunari liaison beautiful." "Yes. Out loud. It was supposed to be in my head." "But it was not in your head." The translator picked it up. Suri closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. Then she opened her tablet and began scrolling through files. The cultural briefing documents that the diplomatic corps had sent to every crew member before the program started. The ones that were 200 pages long. the ones that Dojin had skimmed because he thought his own research was enough. She found what she was looking for in less than a minute. She turned the tablet around and pushed it across the table. Dojin read the section. Then he read it again. Then he read it a third time, because his brain refused to accept what his eyes were telling it. Among the Lunari, my direct verbal statements about another person's physical beauty were not casual. They were not compliments the way humans understood compliments. In Lunari culture, to look at someone and say sincerely that they were beautiful was one of the most intimate acts a person could perform. It was not like saying someone looked nice or had pretty eyes. It was deeper than that, closer to saying, I see everything you are, and I find it worthy of admiration. It carried the weight of emotional honesty, vulnerability, and desire all wrapped into a single moment. It was, in simple terms, the Lunari equivalent of a love confession. Not a small one, not a casual one, the kind that changed everything. Dojin put his head back on the table. I'm going to die, he said. You're not going to die, Suri said. But you might wish you could. He looked up again. I'll apologize. I'll explain it was an accident. I didn't know what it meant. She'll understand. Suri held up one finger. She scrolled further down the document. She found another section and turned the tablet again. Dojin read it. His face went from pale to gray. In Lunari culture, retracting a beauty statement was one of the cruelest things a person could do. To tell someone they were beautiful and then take it back was not seen as a correction or a mistake. It was seen as a lie. It meant the speaker had looked at the other person, spoken words of deep intimacy, and then declared that none of it was real. It was emotional manipulation. It was considered worse than never speaking at all. There was even a word for it in the Lunari language, a word that roughly translated to the one who gives light and then takes it away. It was not a word anyone wanted to be called. Dojin sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling offered no solutions. So I can't take it back, he said. No. And I can't apologize. Not without making it worse. What am I supposed to do? Suri leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. There was a look on her face that Dojin recognized. The look she got when she found something both terrible and deeply entertaining at the same time. Honestly, I have no idea. But this is the most interesting thing that has happened on this station since we got here. So I'm going to enjoy every second of it. Dojin groaned. On the other side of the station, in the Lunari quarters, Yanara was not groaning. She was sitting very still in her private room, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. Her hair, which had calmed slightly since the workroom, still held a faint edge of rose gold at the tips, like the last glow of a sunset that refused to fade. Her attendant, a younger Lunari woman named Riel, stood nearby with wide eyes and barely contained excitement. He said it, Riel whispered. He actually said it. A human. To you. He didn't know what he was saying, Yenara replied. Her voice was steady, but her hands tightened in her lap. Humans use such words carelessly. It means nothing to them. But it was translated perfectly. The tone analysis confirmed it. There was no deception in his voice. He meant the words, even if he didn't understand their weight. Yenara said nothing. She knew Riel was right. The translator chips did not just convert words. They measured vocal tone, emotional resonance, sincerity. If the chip had translated his words without flagging them as false or sarcastic, then the human had meant what he said. He had looked at her and genuinely thought she was beautiful. He just had no idea that among her people, that simple thought spoken aloud was the beginning of something enormous. She replayed the moment in her mind, the way he had been looking at her, slightly dazed, slightly lost, as if he had forgotten where he was. The soft, almost helpless way the words had come out of him, like they had escaped without permission. And then the panic on his face when he realized what had happened. She should have been offended. A proper Lunari woman would have been composed, distant, and waiting for formal clarification before reacting. But Yanara had not been composed. She had flushed. Her hair had betrayed every emotion she was feeling, and she had asked him to say it again. That was the part that embarrassed her the most, not what he had said, what she had said back. You asked him to repeat it, Riel said, as if reading her thoughts. There was a grin in her voice. I was surprised. You were affected. That is enough, Riel. But it was not enough. Not for the station, and not for the quiet, spreading whisper that was already moving through the Lunari delegation, like wind through grass. A human had made a beauty statement to the cultural liaison. An unvetted, unceremonious, completely accidental beauty statement. And she had not rejected it. She had asked for it again. For the whisper reached Kyle by evening. He found Yanara in the observation corridor on the Lunari side of the station. She was standing by the long window looking out at the stars. Her hair was calm now, a steady, pale white. But Kyle knew his sister. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed against the glass. I heard what happened, he said. He did not sit down. He stood behind her like a wall. It was a misunderstanding, Yanara said without turning around. A misunderstanding does not make your hair turn rose gold. She turned then. Her eyes met his. He is human, Kyle. He did not know what the words meant. I will not punish him for ignorance. And what if he did mean them? Then that is a different conversation. One I intend to have, Cal said. His voice was calm, but his hair, short and dark, not as expressive as Yanara's, shifted to a cold, steely silver. With him, you will do nothing, Yanara said firmly. Not yet. Not until I understand what happened. He is my work partner for this program, and I will not have you turning a mistake into an incident. Cal studied her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. But Yenara knew her brother. He would not let this go. He was watching now, and he would keep watching until he was satisfied that the human was either sincere or a fool. The problem was that Dojin was both, and Yenara was already beginning to suspect that the combination was more dangerous than either one alone. She turned back to the window. The stars were steady and cold and impossibly far away. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Silver skin, violet eyes, and at the very tips of her hair, a stubborn trace of rose gold that would not fade no matter how hard she tried to calm it. She pressed her forehead against the glass and closed her eyes. She could still hear his voice, soft, unguarded, entirely honest. A whisper that was never meant to be heard. She's really beautiful. Yenara let out a long breath and opened her eyes. Foolish human, she murmured. But there was no anger in the words, only something warm and uncertain and new, something she did not yet have a name for in any language. The next morning, Dojin stood outside the workroom door for 11 minutes before going in. He knew it was 11 minutes because he counted every second. Each one felt like a small punishment for the crime of having a mouth that worked faster than his brain. He had spent the entire night going over his options. He could not take back what he said. He could not apologize for it. He could not request a new partner without raising questions that would make things worse. The only path forward was to walk into that room, sit down, and do his job like a professional. He was not confident he could manage even that. When he finally opened the door, Yanara was already there. She sat at the far end of the table, her hands folded neatly, her posture straight and formal. She was not wearing the diplomatic veil. That small detail made Dojin's stomach tighten. It meant she still considered their working relationship one of trust. Despite everything, her hair was a controlled, steady white, completely neutral. She had clearly spent effort making sure it would not betray anything. Good morning, she said. Her voice was perfectly even. Good morning, Dojin replied. He sat down at his end of the table, as far from her as possible without sitting in the hallway. They worked. For the first hour, neither of them said anything that was not directly related to linguistic analysis. They reviewed Lunari phonetic structures. They compared vowel sounds. They mapped tonal patterns onto human equivalents. It was dry, technical, necessary work. And Dojin clung to it like a drowning man clinging to a piece of wood. But language is not just sounds and grammar. Language is culture. And the deeper they went into the Lunari language, the more they had to talk about what the words actually meant. Not just their dictionary definitions, but their emotional weight, their history, the feeling of them. That was where things became difficult. This word, Dojin said, pointing to a symbol on his tablet. My notes say it means light, but it appears in contexts where light doesn't make sense. What am I missing? Yanara leaned forward to look. When she did, the distance between them shrank. Dojin could smell something faint and clean, like cold air after rain. The word has two layers, she said. The surface meaning is light, as in the light of a star. But the deeper meaning is closer to the feeling of being seen. When light falls on something, it makes that thing visible. So in our language, light and being truly seen are the same concept. Dojin stared at her. His linguist brain caught fire. That's incredible, he said, and he meant it. In Korean, my language, we have a similar idea. There's a word, none bit, which literally means eye light. It's the light in someone's eyes when they look at you. The feeling of being noticed. Yanara's hair shifted, just slightly. A thin thread of soft blue appeared at the roots, the color of interest, of warmth. She caught it and controlled it almost instantly, but Dojin saw it. He was starting to learn how to read her the way he read texts, looking for the meaning beneath the surface. Your species understands this, she said. There was a note of surprise in her voice. Sometimes, Dojin said, when we pay attention. That was the first real conversation they had. It was small. It was careful. But it cracked something open between them. A tiny door that neither of them had the courage to close. Over the next 2 weeks, for the door widened. They worked together every day, 6 hours minimum. The program required them to cover a massive amount of material, idioms, cultural practices, emotional vocabulary, taboo words, formal speech patterns. It was more work than Dojin had expected, and he quickly realized that his pre-mission research, while impressive on paper, had barely scratched the surface of Lunari culture. Yanara, for her part, was a patient teacher. She explained things clearly and without judgment. When Dojin made mistakes, mispronouncing a word so badly that it changed from honored elder to pickled vegetable, she corrected him gently, though he could swear the corners of her mouth twitched. But it was not just the formal sessions that brought them closer. It was the small moments in between. Dojin learned that Yanara's hair was more expressive than she wanted it to be. When she was amused, the tips turned a soft, warm blue. When she was frustrated, usually with Dojin's pronunciation, they went pale silver. When she was concentrating deeply, her hair would settle into a calm, steady lavender, and she would tuck a strand behind her ear without realizing she was doing it. And rose gold. That color appeared only rarely, in flickers so quick that most people would miss them. But Dojin noticed. It happened when he said something unexpectedly honest, or when he looked at her for a moment too long, or when their hands accidentally came close on the table. Rose gold, the color of being affected, the color of feeling something you were not ready to name. He noticed it, and he said nothing, but he kept noticing. Yenera, meanwhile, was learning about humans, and humans, she was discovering, were the most confusing species in the known galaxy. Explain this to me, she said one afternoon, leaning over a tablet that showed a collection of human expressions and idioms. A human says, I'm fine, when they are clearly not fine. A human laughs when hearing terrible news. A human insults their closest friend and calls it affection. Why? Why do you hide everything? Dojin thought about it. I don't think we're hiding, he said slowly. I think we're just bad at matching our outsides to our insides. We feel things deeply, but the way we show those feelings doesn't always make sense. Sometimes we laugh because if we don't laugh, we'll cry. Sometimes we say, I'm fine, because we don't want to put our pain on someone else. That sounds exhausting. It is. Yenara looked at him with those deep violet eyes. And what about the insults? The ones that mean affection? Dojin smiled. That one's easy. If someone is close enough that you can tease them, and they still stay, that proves they're real. The teasing isn't the point. The staying is. Yanara's hair shifted to soft blue. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Your species is very strange, Han Dojin. I know. I did not say it was a bad thing. Something about the way she said it made the air in the room change. Dojin felt it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature controls. He swallowed and looked down at his notes, and they went back to work. But the door between them had opened a little wider. The shift happened on a Thursday evening. They had stayed late to work on a special project, translating a collection of classical Lunari love poems into human languages. It was delicate work. Lunari poetry was built on layers of meaning, where a single line could contain 3 or 4 ideas woven together like threads in a tapestry. Translating it required understanding not just the words, but the feelings behind them. They had been working on one poem for over an hour. It described the moment when one person first sees another, not with their eyes, but with their heart. The poem used the word for light that Dojin had asked about on their first real day of work, the word that meant being seen. Dojin read his translation aloud. It was rough, imperfect, but he had tried to capture the feeling of the original rather than just the literal meaning. When he finished, the room was quiet. He looked up. Yenra was watching him. Her hair had shifted without her noticing. It was no longer white or blue or lavender. It was rose gold, not a flicker this time. A steady, deep, unmistakable rose gold that glowed in the low light of the workroom like a quiet fire. She realized it at the same moment he did. Her hand flew to her hair, touching it as if she could press the color back inside. Her eyes widened with something that looked like embarrassment, or fear, or both. Dojin looked at her. She looked at him. The translated poem sat between them on the table, full of words about seeing someone for the first time with your whole heart. Neither of them spoke. After a long moment, Yanara stood, and as she gathered her things with hands that moved a little too quickly. "We should stop for tonight," she said. Her voice was almost steady. Almost. "Yeah," Dojin said. "Good idea." She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, her back to him. Her hair was still rose gold. She stood there for 3 heartbeats. He counted, and then she left without looking back. Dojin sat alone in the workroom. The poem glowed on the tablet screen. The stars turned slowly outside the window. He put his head in his hands and let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. Because somewhere between the grammar lessons and the mispronounced words and the small moments of honest conversation, something had changed. He was not just studying the Lunari language anymore. He was learning Yanara. And she, whether she admitted it or not, it was learning him. And that, he was beginning to realize, was far more dangerous than any word he could accidentally say. Kyle found Dojin in the station's small garden, a room on the human side filled with real soil, grow lights, and rows of green plants that the crew maintained for both food and sanity. Dojin liked to sit there in the mornings before his sessions with Yanara. The smell of earth and growing things calmed him. It reminded him of his grandmother's garden back in Busan, where he had spent his childhood pulling weeds and listening to stories. He was sitting on a bench between 2 rows of tomato plants when the door opened and Kale walked in. Dojin had never spoken to Kale directly. He had seen him at the welcome ceremony and occasionally in the corridors. A tall, a sharp-featured Lunari with cold silver eyes and the posture of someone who had spent his life standing between things he loved and things that might hurt them. His hair was kept short, almost military, and it rarely showed color. Dojin had assumed that meant Kale simply did not feel things strongly. He was wrong. It meant Kale had spent years learning to hide what he felt. Kyle stood at the end of the garden row and looked down at Dojin with an expression that could have frozen water. "Han Dojin," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, I am Kyle, Yenara's brother. I believe you already know why I am here." Dojin set down the small watering can he had been using. His mouth went dry, but he forced himself to meet Kale's eyes. Running away once was embarrassing. Running away twice would be pathetic. "I think I do," he said. Kale clasped his hands behind his back. When he spoke, his voice was calm and controlled, but there was iron underneath it. "You made a beauty statement to my sister. In our culture, this is not something that is done carelessly. It is not a passing remark. It is the first step of a formal process, one that carries expectations, obligations, and consequences." Dojin nodded slowly. "I've been told." "Then you should also know that a beauty statement, once spoken and not retracted, begins what we call the path of seeing. It has 3 stages. The first is the naming, the moment when one person acknowledges another's beauty aloud. You have already completed this stage, whether you intended to or not." He paused. His silver eyes held Dojin's with the steady pressure of a blade resting against skin, not cutting, but making it very clear that it could. The second stage is the offering. The speaker presents something to the one they have named. It must be something that represents the speaker's true inner self, not a gift of wealth or status, but something personal, something that reveals who they are at their core. And the third? Dojin asked. The choosing. The one who was named decides whether to accept the speaker or decline. If they accept, a bond is formed. If they decline, the matter is closed with honor on both sides. Kale's jaw tightened. But if the speaker fails to reach the offering stage within a reasonable period, if they leave the naming unanswered, it is considered emotional negligence, an act of cruelty. It tells the named that they were seen, admired, are and then abandoned. The weight of those words settled onto Dojin's shoulders like stones. How long do I have? He asked quietly. By our customs, a full lunar cycle from the moment of naming. In your human time, roughly 30 days. Kyle tilted his head. You have already used 17 of them. 13 days. Dojin had 13 days to either complete a formal alien courtship ritual or find a way out that didn't destroy Yanara's dignity. I want to be clear, Kyle continued. I do not believe you are worthy of my sister. Humans are impulsive, short-lived, and emotionally chaotic. You stumble through the universe breaking things you do not understand and calling it exploration. But my sister has asked me not to interfere, and I will respect her wishes, for now. He stepped closer. The temperature in the garden seemed to drop. But if you hurt her, by negligence, by cowardice, or by treating this as something to escape from, I will not need to interfere. Your own shame will be punishment enough. Among our people, the name for someone who abandons a naming is spoken in whispers. You do not want that name, human. Not here. Not on a station where our species are learning to trust each other. He turned and walked out without waiting for a response. The garden door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded, to Dojin, like the closing of a trap. Dojin sat among the tomato plants for a long time. Then he got up and went to find Suri. He found her in the engineering bay, buried under a console panel with a wrench in her teeth. He told her everything. She climbed out from under the panel, sat on the floor, and listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Suri, and told him how serious she understood the situation to be. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, So you need to give her something that represents your true self. Yes. Your true self is a man who mutters in Korean, forgets to eat lunch, and has more dictionaries than friends. Thank you, Suri. I'm being helpful. Knowing who you are is the first step. She leaned back against the console. Look, you have two options. Option 1, you find some clever diplomatic loophole that lets you exit the path of seeing without dishonoring her. I can help you look for one, but based on what I've read, Lunari customs don't really have escape hatches. They take this stuff seriously. And option 2? Option 2 is you stop running and actually think about what you want. Dojin frowned. What I want doesn't matter. This is a cultural obligation I accidentally triggered. Suri gave him a look. The look she had been giving him since university. The one that meant he was being smart about words and stupid about everything else. Dojin, you called her beautiful, and you meant it. You've spent 3 weeks working with her, and I've watched you come back from those sessions with this look on your face. Like you've been breathing different air. You talk about her language like it's music. You notice when her hair changes color. You know what her different silences mean. She pointed the wrench at him. This stopped being just a cultural accident a while ago. And you know it. He opened his mouth to argue. Nothing came out. Suri nodded. That's what I thought. That evening, Dojin went to the workroom early. Yanara was not there yet. He sat at the table and waited, his heart beating in a way that annoyed him, because it suggested his body knew things his mind refused to accept. When Yenara arrived, she looked at him and immediately knew something was different. Her hair flickered, a quick flash of rose gold, controlled instantly. Your brother came to see me, Dojin said. Yenara's expression tightened. I told him not to. He told me about the path of seeing, the 3 stages, the timeline. She sat down slowly. Her hands were folded in her lap again, the way they always were when she was trying to hold herself together. And what will you do? She asked. Dojin took a breath. And he had spent the whole day preparing a careful, diplomatic speech about cultural misunderstandings and mutual respect and finding an honorable solution. He had rehearsed it in the mirror. He had written notes. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was something else entirely. Something simpler and more honest than anything he had planned. "I want to ask you something first," he said. "When I said those words, when the translator broadcast them, I didn't understand what they meant in your culture. That's true. But your brother told me that the translator measures sincerity, that it wouldn't have translated the words the way it did if I didn't mean them." He paused. Then he looked directly at her. "Did you know that? That the words were sincere?" Yanara held his gaze. Her hair was shifting again. Am I the rose gold creeping in from the roots despite her best efforts? "Yes," she said softly. "I knew." "Then I want to be honest with you, not because of your customs or the timeline or your brother, because you deserve honesty." He swallowed. "I spoke without thinking that day, but the words themselves, the feeling behind them, that was real. I did think you were beautiful. I still do. I just didn't know that saying it would mean what it means here." The room was very quiet. Yenara's hands, still folded in her lap, had gone still in a way that suggested she was holding her breath. "But did you mean the words themselves?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not the cultural meaning, not the obligation, the words. Did you mean them?" Dojin felt something shift inside him. A wall he had built out of caution and professionalism and the fear of making things worse, cracking down the middle. "Yes," he said, "I meant them." Yenra's hair blazed rose gold. Not a flicker, not a thread. The full length of it, from root to tip, lit up like sunrise on water. Her eyes shone, and her breath came out in a small, unsteady sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. "Then the naming was true," she said. "That is all that matters to us." She smiled at him. The first real, unguarded smile he had ever seen from her. It was small and quiet and trembling at the edges, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen on any world. Dojin smiled back. It was clumsy and uncertain and entirely human. And for the first time since he had walked into this workroom and accidentally changed both their lives, he did not want to run. He wanted to stay. Dojin had 10 days to figure out the offering, and he spent the first 3 of them in a state of quiet panic that Suri described as watching a very intelligent man try to solve a math problem with his feelings. The rules were simple but terrifying. The offering had to represent his true inner self, not a display of skill, not a show of wealth, not a performance. It had to be something honest, something that, when Yanara looked at it, would tell her who Han Dojin really was at his core. The problem was that Dojin was not entirely sure he knew the answer to that question himself. He sat in his quarters on the 4th night, surrounded by crumpled notes and failed ideas, or staring at the ceiling as if it owed him something. He had considered and rejected a dozen options. A linguistic analysis of Lunari poetry, too academic. A recording of himself speaking in Lunari, too performative. A piece of music. He couldn't play any instruments. A drawing. His artistic ability had peaked at age 9 and never recovered. Suri found him like that, lying on his back on the floor, arms spread out, looking like a man who had been defeated by the concept of sincerity. "You're overthinking this," she said from the doorway. "I'm not overthinking it. I'm thinking about it the exact right amount. The amount happens to be destroying me." She walked in and sat on the edge of his desk. "Okay, let's approach this differently. Forget the ritual. Forget the Lunari. If you had to show someone, anyone, who you really are, what would you give them?" "Words," Dojin said without hesitation. Then he blinked, surprised by how quickly the answer had come. Suri raised an eyebrow. "Words?" He sat up slowly. "That's what I've always been. Words are how I understand the world. I don't paint. I don't build things. I don't have any great talents except this one. I take words from one language and carry them into another. I find the meaning inside them, and I try to keep it alive during the crossing." He paused. "It's the only thing I've ever been good at." "Then do that," Suri said simply. Dojin looked at her, and for the first time in days, something clicked into place in his mind, like a key turning in a lock. He knew what to make. For the next 6 days, Dojin barely slept. He worked in his quarters after his sessions with Yenara. It's sometimes until the station's artificial dawn cycle began and the corridor lights shifted from cool blue to warm gold. He drank too much coffee. He forgot to eat until Suri left food outside his door, with notes that said things like, "Eat this or I will tell Yenara you're dying. And seriously, Dojin, I can hear your stomach from the engineering bay." What he was making was a book, not a printed book, not a digital file, a handwritten book on real paper he had begged from the station's small supply of earth materials. He used a pen, an actual pen, the kind that left ink on skin and smudged if you weren't careful. Each page was written by hand in careful, slightly imperfect Korean characters. The book contained translations of Lunari love poems, not clinical, academic translations, not the dry, technically accurate versions that would appear in a scholarly journal. These were living translations, ones that tried to capture not just what the poem said, but what they felt. Dojin had taken the original Lunari texts he and Yenare had been working on together and transformed them into Korean, pouring his own understanding, his own emotion, his own interpretation into every line. And in the margins, he wrote notes, small, handwritten annotations in his own messy script, explaining what each poem had made him feel. Not as a linguist, as a person. Next to a poem about two stars orbiting each other, he wrote, "This one made me think about gravity, how some forces are invisible, but they still hold everything together." Next to a poem about a first meeting, he wrote, "I think the poet understood that the most important moments in life are the ones we don't plan for." Next to the poem they had translated together, the one about being seen with the heart, he wrote, "This is the one that changed things. I read it and I thought about you, and I couldn't stop. It was clumsy. It was personal. It was the most honest thing he had ever created." On the 10th day, Dojin requested a private meeting with Yenara. Not in the workroom, in the observation corridor on the neutral side of the station, where the long windows looked out into open space and the stars hung like scattered light against the dark. Yenara arrived wearing a simple silver garment, not her formal diplomatic attire, but something softer, more personal. Her hair was carefully neutral, held at a steady white, but Dojin could see the effort it took. The edges kept wanting to shift. He stood by the window with the book held against his chest. His hands were shaking. He was not good at this. He was not good at any of this. But he was here, and he was going to try. "I understand this is the offering," Yenara said. She stood a few steps away, her hands clasped in front of her. Her voice was formal, but her eyes were not formal at all. They were wide and bright and full of something that looked like hope held very carefully, like water in cupped hands. "It is," Dojin said. He held out the book. Yenara took it. Her fingers brushed his during the exchange, and they were warm, warmer than he expected. She held the book gently as if she could feel how much of him was inside it. She opened the first page. Dojin watched her read. He watched her eyes move across his handwriting. The Korean characters she couldn't read. The Lunari text beside them that she could. He had included both versions on every page so she could see where his translations had departed from the original, where he had chosen feeling over precision, where he had added something of himself. She turned to the second page, the third. She read his margin notes, the small, honest confessions he had written in Lunari so she could understand them. Her hair began to change. Blue first, the warm blue of interest and connection. Then something deeper. Then something Dojin had never seen before. Colors began moving through her hair that he had no name for. They were not in any of his reference materials. They shifted and blended and glowed with an intensity that made the observation corridor feel brighter. Blues that were almost purple, golds that were almost white, silvers that hummed with warmth instead of cold. Her hair was doing something Dojin's training had not prepared him for. It was expressing emotions that the Lunari did not have public words for. Private colors, deep colors, the kind that only appeared when a feeling was too big for language. Yenara reached the last poem, the one about being seen. She read his margin note, her hand stilled on the page. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. Lunari could cry, he realized. He had not known that. No one has ever given me their feelings in written form before, she said. Her voice was not steady. She was not trying to make it steady. Lunari do not write emotions. Akashuris, we speak them. We show them. But we do not put them on paper and hand them to another person. She held the book against her chest, mirroring the way he had held it moments ago. This is not just an offering, Han Dojin. This is something I do not have a word for. In any language. Dojin's throat was tight. I'm not good at speaking, he said. I never have been. But I'm good at this, at finding words and putting them where they belong. So I thought if I couldn't say who I am, I could write it, and you could read it, and maybe that would be enough. Yenera stepped closer, close enough that he could see the tears on her lashes, catching the starlight. Close enough that the warmth of her skin reached him like sunlight through glass. It is enough, she whispered. It is more than enough. Her hair settled into a color he would later learn was called something that roughly translated to the warmth of being held. It was gold, not the rose gold of being flustered or affected, but a deep, steady, warm gold that seemed to come from somewhere inside her rather than reflecting from outside. It was the most intimate color a Lunari's hair could show, and she let him see it. She stood there, her hair glowing gold, her eyes shining, holding his clumsy handwritten book of translated poems and margin notes against her heart, and she let him see all of it without hiding anything. Word spread fast. The human crew heard it from Suri, who could not keep a secret when she was proud. The Lunari crew heard it from Riel, who could not keep a secret under any circumstances. By the next day, now the entire station knew that the human linguist had given the Lunari cultural liaison a handwritten book of love poems as his offering. The human crew thought it was romantic. The Lunari crew thought it was extraordinary. Some of the Lunari elders on the communication channels from the homeworld used a phrase that Dojin had to look up. It translated roughly to remarkably pure. Even Kale, who had been watching from behind a pillar at the far end of the observation corridor, said nothing as he walked away. But Suri, who had been watching Cal from behind a different pillar, swore she saw a flicker of pale blue in his short hair. Respect. Just a flicker. But it was there. In the days that followed, something shifted on the station. Dojin and Yenera were no longer just work partners maintaining careful distance, and they walked the observation deck together in the evenings, their conversation easy and warm, mixing Korean and Lunari and the strange private shorthand they had begun to build between them. Her hair was almost always soft blue when they were together, the color of contentment. He was not running anymore, and she was not hiding. The offering had been accepted. Now they were waiting for the choosing, and for the first time, Dojin found that waiting did not feel like fear. It felt like hope. The message came from the Lunari homeworld on a Tuesday morning, and it broke everything. Dojin did not hear about it right away. He was in the workroom, organizing the next set of translations, when he noticed that the Lunari side of the station had gone quiet. Not the ordinary kind of quiet, the kind where people were still moving and working and existing. This was the kind of quiet that came before storms, the kind where even the air seemed to pull back, waiting for something to fall. Suri found him 20 minutes later. Her face was tight. "There's a problem," she said. She explained it in quick, efficient sentences, the way she always did when something was serious. A political faction within the Lunari government, a group called the Preservers, had been growing in power for months. They believed that contact with humans was a mistake. They argued that human culture was loud, chaotic, and emotionally undisciplined, and that prolonged exposure to it would dilute the purity of Lunari traditions. They had been pushing to shut down the cultural exchange program since before it started, and now they had found their symbol. Dojin and Yenara. The Preservers had learned about the beauty statement, the courtship, the offering. They had taken it and turned it into a weapon. On the Lunari homeworld, they were broadcasting speeches arguing that a human performing Lunari courtship rituals was proof that the exchange program was not about mutual learning. It was about humans infiltrating and corrupting Lunari culture from the inside. They called Dojin's offering a mockery. They called Yenara a collaborator. They said that a human could never truly understand what a beauty statement meant, and that allowing one to complete the path of seeing was an insult to every Lunari who had ever walked it sincerely. Dojin sat very still while Suri talked. When she finished, the only thing he said was, "Does Yenara know?" "She knows. Ikael told her this morning." "Dojin, there's more." "Tell me." "The Lunari Diplomatic Council has issued an order. They're recalling Yenara to the homeworld for a formal review. Kale has been ordered to ensure her compliance." Suri paused. "She has to leave within 48 hours. Something cold and heavy settled in Dojin's chest. It was not panic. He was past panic. It was the feeling of watching something precious being taken apart by people who had never bothered to look at it closely enough to understand what it was. He found Yanara in the observation corridor. She was standing by the window in the exact spot where he had given her the book. Her hair was a color he had never seen before. Not rose gold, not warm gold, not blue. It was a dull, pale gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The color of grief. She turned when she heard him approach. Her eyes were dry, but they held the kind of pain that was too deep for tears, the kind that sat behind the eyes and pressed outward without ever breaking through. "You heard," she said. "I heard." She turned back to the window. The stars outside were the same as always. Steady, cold, indifferent to the small dramas of the people who live between them. "The preservers have been waiting for something like this," she said. Her voice was flat and careful, each word placed precisely, as if she was afraid that speaking with any emotion would shatter the control she was barely maintaining. A human and a Lunari in a courtship? It is exactly the kind of thing they can use to make people afraid. Fear is easy to create. Understanding takes time. "What do you want to do?" Dojin asked. "What I want does not matter. The council has given an order. Kyle has been told to enforce it. If I refuse, it becomes a diplomatic incident. Something much larger than the two of us. It could damage the entire program. Everything we built here." She said we, meaning humans and Lunari together. The program, the work. But Dojin heard the other we underneath it. The one that meant him and her. The small and fragile thing they had been building in the spaces between translations and shared evenings and colors that had no public names. "So you're going to leave," he said. "I do not have a choice." "There's always a choice." She looked at him sharply. Her hair flickered, a brief, hot flash of silver that meant frustration. "That is a very human thing to say." "Maybe, but it's also true." "It is not true for everyone, Dojin. Not for me. I am not just a person. I am a representative of my people. My actions reflect on every Lunari on this station, on the entire exchange program, on the relationship between our species. I cannot make a selfish decision without it becoming something political." Dojin stepped closer. "And what if the decision isn't selfish? What if it's the right one?" Yanara shook her head. "You don't understand. Among my people, duty is not something we choose. It is something we are. From the moment I was old enough to speak, I was taught that my purpose was to serve my people, to honor our traditions, to put the needs of the many above my own desires. I have never questioned that. I have never needed to. Until now." She was silent for a long time. The gray in her hair deepened. So when Dojin felt something tighten in his chest because he was learning to read her too well, and gray meant she was losing something she did not know how to hold on to. "I need to ask you something," he said. He spoke gently, the way he had learned to speak around her. Not because she was fragile, but because he understood now that his words reached her in ways that human words were not supposed to reach anyone. "Forget the council, forget the preservers, forget the program and the politics and your duty. Just for one moment. What does Yanara want?" Her eyes met his. Something cracked in her careful, controlled expression. A break in the wall she had built that morning. Tiny but real. "I don't know," she whispered. "I have never been allowed to want something that contradicted my duty. I don't even know what wanting for myself feels like. It is like asking me to speak a language I was never taught." Dojin smiled. It was sad and warm and full of recognition. "Then that's the most human thing you've ever said." Yenara stared at him. And then, against everything, against the grief and the politics and the weight of an entire civilization's expectations, She laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was small and startled, and a little broken at the edges, like a bird trying to fly after being kept in a cage too long. But it was real. It came from somewhere deep inside her, from the same place where her hair found its colors and her eyes found their light. Her hair changed. The gray pulled back like clouds retreating, and in its place came a color Dojin had only seen once before, the warm, deep gold, the private color. The one she had shown him after the offering, the one she said she could not translate. There it is again, he said softly. That color. She touched her hair. She knew. She could feel the warmth of it. I still cannot translate it, she said. But I think it is something close to what you mean when you say hope. Or perhaps home. The two ideas are similar in my language. Hope and home are similar for us too, Dojin said. We just don't always realize it. They stood together by the window. The stars turned slowly. The station hummed its mechanical hum. Somewhere on the other side of the glass, a universe carried on without caring what two small people from two different worlds felt about each other. Yenera straightened. The gold in her hair dimmed, but did not disappear entirely. It remained at the very tips, or like a promise she was not ready to speak aloud. I will go, she said. I have to. But I want you to know that the book you gave me, your offering, I will take it with me. I will read it on the transport. I will read it on the homeworld. And every time I read your words, I will remember that a human once wrote his feelings on paper and handed them to me, and it was the most sincere thing anyone has ever done. Dojin's eyes stung. He blinked and looked away because he was human, and humans were terrible at showing what they felt. And this was the worst possible moment to prove that point. Can I walk you to the transport? He asked. No, she said gently. If you do, I will not be able to leave. She reached out and touched his hand, just the tips of her fingers against his, light and warm and brief. It was the first time they had touched. In Lunari terms, it was the equivalent of a kiss. Then she pulled away, turned, and walked down the corridor toward the Lunari side of the station. Her hair streamed behind her, gray at the roots, gold at the tips, shifting between grief and hope with every step. Dojin did not follow. He stood by the window and watched her go, and he did not move until long after she had disappeared around the corner, and the sound of her footsteps had faded into silence. 2 hours later, he went to the docking bay and watched the Lunari transport detach from the station. It was a graceful ship, sleek and silver, like the people who built it. It turned slowly against the stars, oriented itself toward the distant Lunari homeworld, and slipped away into the dark. Suri found him there an hour later. She's still standing at the bay window, his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the point of light where the transport had vanished. She's gone, he said. I know. She might not come back. Suri stood beside him. She did not touch him or try to comfort him with words. She just stood there, the way a good friend does when words are useless, and presence is the only thing that matters. After a long silence, Dojin said, She told me she couldn't translate that color, the gold one. Maybe she doesn't need to, Suri said quietly. Maybe some things are better felt than said. Dojin closed his eyes. Behind them, the ghost of warm gold light lingered like a memory that refused to fade. 3 months passed. The station kept spinning. The stars kept burning. And Dojin kept working. Because that was what he knew how to do when everything else was uncertain. He buried himself in words and let them carry him forward. The political crisis on the Lunari homeworld ran its course the way political crises usually do. Loudly, messily, and with a great deal of arguing that ultimately changed less than anyone expected. The preservers had made their case. They had used Dojin and Yanara as their symbol of everything wrong with human contact. They had demanded the cultural exchange program be shut down permanently. But something unexpected happened. The story of the human linguist and the Lunari liaison spread beyond the political arena. Ordinary Lunari people heard about it. Not the version the preservers were telling, but the real version. The version where a quiet, one awkward human had accidentally spoken words of beauty to an alien woman, and instead of running from the consequences, he had learned her culture, respected her traditions, and given her his feelings written on paper in his own imperfect hand. The Lunari people, it turned out, found that story far more interesting than the preservers' anger. Letters and messages began arriving at the diplomatic council, not from politicians or military leaders, but from teachers, poets, artists, and ordinary families. They wrote about how the story reminded them of what their traditions were actually meant to protect. Not purity, but sincerity. Not isolation, but the courage to be truly seen by another person, even if that person came from a different world. One letter written by an elderly Lunari poet was read aloud in the council chamber. It said, "A roughly translated, if a human can learn to speak our language of the heart more honestly than some of our own people speak it, then perhaps we have been too busy guarding the door to notice who deserves to walk through it." The preservers lost their momentum. The exchange program was renewed under new terms, broader, more open, with commitments from both sides to deepen the cultural work rather than restrict it. Cal was reassigned to the station as a permanent security liaison, a sign that the Lunari government was investing in the program's future rather than preparing for its end. But Yanara's name was not on the new delegation roster. Dojin did not ask about it. He did not search for information or send messages to the Lunari homeworld. He had learned enough about Lunari culture to know that the choosing could not be rushed. It was Yanara's decision to make, and pressing for an answer, even indirectly, would dishonor the process they had both committed to. So he waited, and while he waited, he worked. He finished the translation project he and Yanara had started together, a complete anthology of classical Lunari love poetry rendered into Korean and English. It was the first work of its kind, a bridge between two species built entirely out of words. He spent weeks polishing every line, checking every nuance, making sure that each poem carried the weight and beauty of the original while living comfortably in its new language. When the anthology was complete, he wrote a dedication on the first page. He wrote it in Lunari, in his own hand, the way he had written the margin notes in the book he had given Yanara. Thus it said, "For the one who taught me that beauty is not a word, but a promise." Suri read the dedication over his shoulder and told him he was being dramatic. He said he knew. She said the anthology was brilliant. He said he knew that too. She hit him on the back of the head with a rolled-up maintenance report, and for a moment, things felt almost normal. The new Lunari delegation was scheduled to arrive on a Thursday. Dojin had been asked to be at the docking bay as part of the welcoming committee. A formality, his supervisor said, a show of continuity. The linguist who had been there from the beginning, present to welcome the new chapter. Dojin put on a clean uniform. He stood in the docking bay with the rest of the human delegation. Diplomats, engineers, scientists, Suri in the back row pretending she was not taking photographs. The bay was polished and bright, the observation windows showing the slow approach of the Lunari transport as it glided toward the station like a silver bird coming home. The transport docked, the airlock cycled, the doors opened. The new delegation walked through, 5 Lunari in formal attire, veiled and composed. Kyle led them, his posture straight and his expression unreadable, the same as always. And behind him, stepping through the airlock with the careful grace of someone who had made a decision and was no longer afraid of it, was Yanara. Dojin's breath stopped. She was not wearing a diplomatic veil. Her face was open, visible, unhidden. Her silver garment was simple, not formal, not official, personal. She carried nothing in her hands. Her hair, long and luminous, was already shifting color before she had fully entered the bay. Rose gold, deep, steady, unmistakable rose gold, the color of being affected, the color of feeling something so strongly that the body could no longer contain it. She saw him immediately. Across the bay, past the rows of diplomats and officials and the careful choreography of the formal welcome, her eyes found his the way a compass finds north, without hesitation, without searching, as if she had always known exactly where he would be standing. She walked toward him. The other delegates stepped aside. The formal protocol of the welcome ceremony dissolved around her like mist in sunlight, because there was something about the way she moved, steady, sure, trembling at the edges, that told everyone in that room this moment was not about diplomacy. She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch, close enough that he could see the light shifting in her hair, and the brightness in her eyes, and the way her hands were trembling at her sides, just like they had trembled the very first time he had called her beautiful. The bay was silent. Every human and Lunari in the room was watching. Yanara took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was clear and calm, and only slightly unsteady, and she spoke in Lunari, the formal, ancient Lunari that was reserved for moments that would be remembered. "I have completed the choosing," she said. "I choose you, Handojin." The silence in the bay deepened. It was the kind of silence that happens when the world pauses to make room for something important. Dojin stared at her. His eyes burned. His throat closed. He was a linguist, a man who had devoted his entire life to words, who could speak 4 human languages and read 2 dead ones, and had spent years learning the most complex alien tongue ever discovered. And in that moment, he could not find a single word in any of them. His vision blurred. He blinked and something warm slid down his cheek. He was crying. He was standing in a docking bay full of diplomats and officials from 2 different species, and he was crying, and he did not care. Because she had come back. She had stood before her council and her people, and the weight of her entire civilization's expectations, and she had chosen him. Not because it was easy, not because it was expected, because it was true. He opened his mouth, he closed it, he opened it again, and this time, fully aware of what it meant, in understanding every layer and every implication and every shred of weight those words carried in her language and her culture and her heart, he said it. "You are beautiful, Yenera." Her hair erupted. The rose gold vanished, replaced by warm gold. The deep, steady, radiant gold that she had never been able to translate. It blazed from root to tip, filling the air around her with a soft, living light that turned the docking bay into something that looked less like a room on a space station and more like the inside of a sunrise. The color poured out of her like music, like laughter, like a door thrown open after being closed for too long. She smiled. It was not the small, careful smile from the workroom. It was wide and bright and unguarded, and full of every feeling she had carried across 3 months and the distance between 2 worlds. Tears ran down her silver cheeks and caught the golden light of her hair, and she laughed. A real laugh, free and startled and joyful. And the sound of it filled the bay like a bell ringing in an empty cathedral. She did not ask him to say it again. She did not need to. She could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice, feel it in the way he stepped forward and took her hands in his. Carefully, gently, the way you hold something you intend to keep for a very long time. She already knew he would say it again, every day, in every language he knew, for as long as she would let him. In the back of the bay, Suri pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were red. Her shoulders were shaking. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She was a communications engineer, not a romantic, and she had watched this idiot fumble his way through an accidental alien love confession for months, and she was not going to. She cried, quietly behind her hand, with a smile so wide it hurt. Beside her, Cal stood with his arms crossed and his expression carved from stone. He said nothing. He did not move. But in his short, dark hair that rarely showed any color at all, a faint shimmer of pale blue moved through like a whisper. Respect, acceptance, and perhaps buried underneath where no one could see it, something very close to warmth. The docking bay slowly came back to life. People began to move, to speak, to resume the business of the welcome ceremony. But something had changed in the air, a feeling that everyone on the station would carry with them long after the formal events were over. A human had called an alien beautiful, and it had started as a mistake. But it ended as a promise, spoken in 2 languages, written on paper, carried across the dark between 2 worlds, and answered by a woman who had learned to choose for herself. In the observation corridor, later that evening, Dojin and Yenara stood by the window, where everything had begun and everything had almost ended. The stars turned slowly outside the glass. The station hummed its quiet, mechanical song, and 2 people from 2 different worlds stood together in the space between, holding hands and watching the universe carry on around them. "I figured it out," Yenara said softly. "What?" The gold color. Anna, the one I could not translate. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Her hair, warm and golden, pooled against his arm like sunlight on water. It does not mean hope. It does not mean home. It means both at the same time. It means finding the place where you are allowed to hope. It means coming home to a person instead of a place. Dojin rested his cheek against the top of her head. Her hair was warm. Everything about her was warm. That's beautiful, he said. She smiled against his shoulder. Say it again, human. And this time he did.